Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's already written your resignation letter and is aggressively briefing about you to the press. My name's Cory and my partner in swearing is Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Cory.
And we're going back in time to 2005 this week. We're rewatching the first series of The Thick of It. It's a sitcom about a Labour government with a huge majority that's making up policy on the hoof. It seems overly reliant on focus groups, and it's suffering from an unforgiving media cycle. Truly, so much has changed in British politics over the past 20 years. Give us a second to get our bleepers at the ready, and then we'll dive straight in. Now, Mark, I think anyone even remotely interested in British politics in the last 10, 20 years has probably watched at least one episode of The Thick of It.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually slightly surprised when doing a little bit of reading ahead of this recording about how modest its ratings were at the time. I mean, it was top of the ratings on the channel that it was on, but that channel was BBC4. And so that means it was only seen by a few 100,000 people initially. I suspect that number has gone up quite a lot since, but absolutely within the political bubble that the likes of you and I and our listeners are in, it was a major hit that has been hugely influential in all sorts of ways that we'll doubtless come on to.
First item on the agenda, as always, is events, dear boy, and whether we'd seen this show before. Yes. I think I first came across it when it was reviewed on Newsnight Review, which, given I was probably about 17, 18 when this came out, tells you the sort of teenage years.
The William Hague about you.
Thankfully, I didn't have to address Labour Party conference as a teenager. The Labour Party being in an even worse state than it's ended up in. I've seen a few episodes, but I don't think I've seen this probably in about 15 years before having rewatched it this time.
Yeah, it's one of those shows, isn't it, where you end up so familiar with particular scenes or particular lines that it can be a bit surprising to go back and actually sit down and watch all three episodes. And actually, I was really confused when I did because my DVD, well, the DVD case has two DVDs in it, which in total have 6 episodes, although it's all labelled season 1. I don't know why season 2 was included with season 1, but called season 1 on the DVD that I got. I hope it's a legit DVD that I did buy, but
I wonder if it's because so many, I think 6 episodes is often the traditional length of sitcom series, isn't it? So Fawlty Towers was 2 lots of 6 episodes. So it might be more an homage to that. And I suppose these 6 have a certain thing in common, I suppose we're going to talk about. And we'll talk about that.
Yes, there is a little elephant, a big elephant in the room with how it's aged, isn't there? Which I guess we should maybe address up front. So the star of the series and the winner of one of the 2 BAFTA awards that Series 1 secured was Chris Langham, who subsequently, people may recall, was convicted of a series of child porn offences. And so I wouldn't have been surprised, actually, if Series 1 had now been pulled from BBC iPlayer. I guess anyone looking back at it now, thinking, should we still have it on iPlayer, whatever, must be hugely relieved that the scene featuring Chris Langham as the minister visiting a school, there's no point to which he's on screen with children, which might have made, I guess, a slight difference. But it certainly left me with a bit of a about it, particularly as, although, he was convicted, he's done his time. I think, if somebody has done their time, that doesn't mean we should then completely condemn them to say you're not allowed to do anything in your life ever again, whatever. But his statement, after his conviction and his jail term, his statements in public at least don't seem to have been particularly repentant. So I think there probably will be some people who will look at something featuring him and think, actually, yeah, not for me, I'll pass on that.
No, and I think that would be absolutely fair enough. I mean, there's a really problematic bit. I think in the second series or season, I realise I very incorrectly.
Are you turning American on me, Cory?
It was unforgivable, really, wasn't it? On the notes for this, listeners, I put season 1 and was rightly criticised by Mark for my American English. As someone who always criticises people for using curveball when they should use googly, which is the correct sporting metaphor of choice, I feel suitably repentant. But there's a bit in the second series, I think, where he says there's a photo of him with a moustache that makes him look like a disgraced geography teacher. which
Ooh,
I
yeah.
don't. So I don't know if that. Obviously, we haven't watched
Mm,
the second lot of three yet.
mm.
I don't know if that is still in the iPlayer, but I wonder if we'll come to it there. If you've watched this, or if you know anything about the thick of it and haven't got round to watching it yet, you'll probably know there's a lot of swearing in it.
Mm.
So if you're the sort of person who is offended by bad language, if your mum has come round for the weekend and you're looking for some comfortable Saturday night viewing, probably not the thing you should put on.
Although the
Um,
swearing is done with real panache, and I guess that's one of the things that made this the thick of it so famous. Normally I don't particularly find listening to a drama or a film with lots of swearing in it particularly enjoyable. It just sort of grates with me. But certainly not in this case. I mean, it's done with almost a degree of artistry that elevates it from swearing into, I wouldn't quite say up there with Shakespeare sonnets, but it's, a good way along the road to that level of artistry rather than simply being a collection of four-letter words.
I suppose they have a swearing consultant on it, don't they? Which probably Shakespeare didn't have on his plays. And listeners will be relieved to know I've already edited out all of Mark's swearing from this episode, so keep it relatively clean.
It was
The
all in reaction to you using the word season.
There's two bits of language which are very, very dated. So one is there's a altercation between Malcolm Tucker and a female journalist in which some very gendered, abusive language is used. And there's a comparison, there's a kind of reference to the minister having autism in there as well, which I feel you would not get away with now, even in the context of you are a reprehensible character saying dodgy things. In fact, I mean, one of them is meant to be from a national newspaper article. That felt quite shocking actually on another rewatch. In terms of the plots, actually, this is a bit more plot driven than I'd remembered
Mm.
because they're quite farcical. But if you were going to describe them as Friends episodes, essentially you'd say that the three episodes we're going to talk about in series, not season, series one, are the one in which Hugh Abbott has to announce and then unannounce a policy because the Treasury haven't approved it. The one where they praise the focus group, and there's the one in which it looks like Hugh might have to resign because of issues with his flat. And I don't think that's quite as good as the other two, I have to be honest. I think the other two are quite good, farcical. The plots are quite tight. The third one, it was good, but it wasn't quite as good for me.
And maybe we should try to avoid spoilers because I suspect even if listeners are very familiar with the show, if they go back to watch it, the plot is not really what you remember all the details of. So I found the denouement of the plot in episode 3 a little bit puzzling as to why it is meant to have ended the way it did, which for me took a little bit of the edge off it. But I think overall, across all 3 episodes, it is very heavily plot driven. And as I understand it, if information on the internet is to be believed, that was quite deliberate in that they put a lot of time, Armando Iannucci and his colleagues put a lot of time into working out the plot and then doing the first draft of the script quite quickly based on that. And then, as we'll doubtless come on to talk about, lots of improvisation by the actors within that, but there was a lot of emphasis on getting the basic plot right. And you see that because the plots are, for all that the end of one of the episodes doesn't quite work for me, the plots are really credible and have aged well. They're exactly the sorts of things you can imagine somebody writing a political satire now might replicate.
That's a very good segue to second item on the agenda, All the President's Men. So cast and crew. As you said, it's sort of the idea originally comes from Armando Iannucci, who's done other satirical programs like The Day to Day, Alan Partridge. I think the genesis for this was that there was a sort of public vote, wasn't there? I think about 2004 on Britain's best sitcom. And so the top 10 each had a celebrity putting the case for it. So he put the case forward for Yes Minister being Britain's best sitcom, which I remember watching at the time. Again, this is my tearaway teenage years watching documentaries about Yes Minister, not doing my William Hague comparisons much good here. I think on the back of doing that program, I think he had an idea of trying to update Yes Minister for the modern age, and this is where the thick of it comes out of. And as you say, he got some money from BBC4 to do that.
Well, he only really got enough money to do one big pilot show, but decided to break that down into 3 low budget episodes, which I think was a brilliant decision because the sorts of consequences that flow from that are partly what makes the show. The use of very light, well, I'm sure very skilled sound mixers, for example, in terms of mixing the sound from the microphones on all of the actors, probably a bit of a nightmare job to do. But not having, big setups with complicated lighting and microphones and all of that, but simply sticking mics on each of the actors, all of that ends up freeing them up to really bring out their best. He was also, I think, very lucky, obviously with some skill mixed in there as well, but in casting Peter Capaldi. It's a brilliant casting decision. So not a pure luck-based one, I'm sure, but this is really the show that helped catapult him into the really big time. At the time, it wouldn't have been, oh, that's the new Peter Capaldi show.
Yeah, he was best known, wasn't he, for didn't he direct some Oscar-winning short film whose name completely escapes me now? But I think he was more known as that than an actor, wasn't he? And this,
He'd done a fair amount of radio stuff as well, which
okay, I think you can sort of see the comparisons with Yes Minister a little bit more than in some of the later series because it's quite a closed world, a bit like the Yes Minister set. It's mostly set around the minister called Hugh Abbott, played by Chris Langham, as we've talked about, and his aides. So there's Glenn, who's played by James Smith, and there's Ollie, who's played by Christopher Addison, and then the press officer. And it doesn't have the opposition characters. It doesn't have, say, Robin as another press officer who's in later. It doesn't have Jamie. It has got Lucinda Rakes, who plays Angela Heaney, as a journalist. But it is very focused on that particular world rather than being a bit more expansive. Whereas in later series, it goes into the newspaper offices, it goes into the opposition. You don't really see that in this one.
Yeah, it's the virtue of the low budget approach. They've basically got one building and they can roam around some different rooms in that building, and that's about it.
Yes Minister feels the need to have a laugh track almost to prove that the public like it, whereas this has no laugh track at all. And this one is very obviously about New Labour, whereas Yes Minister, like Jim Hacker's, very much deliberately vague as to his party.
I mean, in some ways, it feels like it's very much of its time, that it is in the sort of Gordon Brown, Tony Blair tensions between Downing Street, Treasury era. Actually, it's aged really very well, almost, I think, in a Yes Minister-like way. I mean, the core conceit of Malcolm Tucker, of this person who thinks he's in charge, but actually goes around causing chaos by regularly screwing up. That feels like that's an idea that's aged quite well. If we think about what's happened in some government since then and some of the government advisors we've had since then. And likewise, the Downing Street Treasury tensions, that very much feels believable. The profusion of bad language. Well, we've had a whole load of political scandals involving just absolutely outrageous and appalling bad language in WhatsApp groups and the like. Oddly, although I think if we'd watched it at the time and been talking about it, we'd have said, oh, this is going to age less well than Yes Minister because it's more of its time. I think it still feels a very contemporary piece of drama.
I feel like every episode we've got to worry about going down massive tangents, but there is something about swearing in politics, isn't there? So next time we're going to talk about All the President's Men, and I suppose when the tapes come out about the Nixon administration, because they make the decision, don't they, to censor out all of the goddams or what have you, and so then you have this. There's a lot of issue. There's a bit of a moral panic then, isn't there, about the swearing? It's not about the intimidation of journalists and the booking of opposition headquarters. The swearing is the real scandal of the Nixon administration. The interesting thing, again, watching this on a rewatch, is my remembering of the Terri character, the Joanna Scanlon character in later series, is that she's a bit useless and a bit lazy. Whereas in this one, actually, I mean, she holds her own. She's not liked because she's a civil servant doing it by the book and, doesn't think outside the box. But actually, her judgment in terms of what they should be doing, actually, if they'd listened to Terri, they'd have ended up in fewer scrapes. And I didn't remember Terry's being that character, so that was interesting.
Yeah, I took it to be that the story, in a way, that Armando Iannucci was trying to tell was all of these political hotshots screw it up, and the diligent civil servants are left to pick up the mess.
I don't think that's the argument Paul Overton and others in the Starmer administration are making. But rounding off All the President's Men, should say that if you've watched the thick of it, especially the sort of 2-hour-long special, so Dan Miller, who occasionally pops up, doesn't he, in the third episode, and he's played by Tony Gardner, who for me would always be the dad in My Parents Are Aliens, speaking of my tearaway teenage years. Right, we've definitely danced around this next section. I think we need to get the agenda back on track, Mark. The Art of the Possible section. So are there any similarities between this TV show and real events.
Yes, and yes. Next item on the agenda, please, Chair.
Well, can we maybe expand on that for
Well, I'd forgotten that Malcolm Tucker's very first line starts, "No, he's useless." And that does epitomize a style of special advisor that we've certainly seen since. But also just the basic idea of Downing Street and Treasury being at odds with each other, the idea of a sort of omnipotent press operation driving policy announcements. That's a very common critique of how policy does and doesn't get made in Britain. The swearing was pretty true to life. I mean, more fun, more imaginative in the
I'm
hands of the script and of the actors' improvisation. Lots of swearing was common at the time and subsequently. Yeah, of course, it's not real life. It's got things for dramatic effect. It's got things for comedic effect, but it doesn't sell you a complete pup of a story, does it?
Are you trying to tell me that the swearing that Alistair Campbell and Charlie Whelan were having in government wasn't as artful and as Shakespearean as the language that's being used in
Well,
this
if
TV
either
show?
of them wish to send me a WhatsApp voice note with a collection of their swearing that we can compare, I'm obviously very happy to include an apology under matters arising next time. But
Absolutely.
actually, the one thing I am intrigued by, because again, reading around it, the production team thought that it was true that actors were quite often used to fake participants in focus groups. That
Ooh.
indeed, that was very much my reaction as well when I came across that. And it's not something I've come across. And so the claim, which seems to have some truth about it, and which is a key plot element at one point, is that if a focus group company can't find enough genuine people to take part, you round up some actors who pretend to be other people with the demographic or other characteristics that the focus group is meant to represent. And yeah,
We
I've not come across that being a genuine scandal, but certainly it seems like the production team felt like they had the inside track on, yes, this does sometimes happen, or at least did sometimes happen.
we should point out to our acting listeners that we do think that actors are real people too.
Yeah, maybe.
I feel the need to kind of push the Yes Minister Thick of It comparison just because that's where the genesis of the show was, and it feels like maybe the difference between Yes Minister and the Thick of It in terms of the reality is, I mean, Yes Minister is much more didactic in a sense, and I'm sure we'll get to that when we talk about Yes Minister. But that a lot of the plot that drives Yes Minister tends to be based on real events, say taken from the Crossman Diaries or other accounts. I think usually of ministers serving in the 70s whose diaries have been published by the time the show's out in the 80s. Whereas, just to paraphrase Stuart Lee a little bit, the thick of it seems very much of this story isn't true, but what it tells us about the government is true.
That line is not nearly as good as the version of the line that's going to hit the cutting room floor and the listeners will never hear, but alas.
Alistair Campbell's red pen just hovers over this episode.
Yeah. It's
But
interesting that you make that comparison because what it makes me think of is that Yes Minister is a bit more policy heavy in that with both shows there are some lessons you can draw for sort of practical insights if you're a politician or a civil servant dealing with communications. But the Yes Minister lessons are much more about how do you deal with policy issues. And actually, there are some quite good, useful lessons in there. Whilst this is much more about how people panic and screw up the communications and therefore mess up policy as a result. It's a bit more of a nihilistic view, perhaps, of politics and politicians.
whereas I think the Yes Minister view seems to very much reflect. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was a huge fan of Yes Minister because I think it sort of essentially reflected her view that you had blocking state and civil
Mm.
servants getting in the way of everything. Whereas, yeah, here it's very much more about the 24-hour media environment.
Yeah, I guess there are characters in Yes Minister where if someone was to tell you, "Oh, that character was based on you," you would be flattered. Is there any character who, if you were told that character is based on you in the thick of it, where you would be anything other than horrified?
No, yeah, I think, but it's
Maybe
just what,
Terry for the reasons we've mentioned, but
which is why I find it interesting that when isn't there a bit where Peter Capaldi ends up going to Downing Street for
mm,
some reason, and there's lots of people are really excited to see him and there's almost a bit of a hero worship I don't think that's too strong of Malcolm Tucker
No,
amongst the.
and I think in although it seems to me so clear on rewatching that he is the center of screwing everything up all the way through, I don't think that's how his character originally came out when the show was broadcast.
No.
It was more. I guess people were drawing the comparisons with Alistair Campbell and the success of New Labour. So perhaps with a little bit more hindsight, we can see the other version of events.
It feels to me a little bit like how the Republicans took on Born in the USA in the 80s without listening to the words. It's like I don't think
Mm.
you weren't you weren't meant to take
We're
this
doing
lesson.
all the hip cultural references this week.
We always have to include at least one hip cultural reference for our younger listeners, Mark. Right, let's get this agenda back on track. So yes, we've sort of circled around, like I imagine many New Labour ministers had to. We've circled around the tensions between number 10 and the Treasury. Maybe the most obvious way that comes out is in 2000, isn't it? When essentially Tony Blair's getting a bit frustrated at
Mm.
the slow pace of change and increasing health spending. And so essentially just goes on David Frost's Sunday show and says we're going to make health spending in the UK the same as the European average, which would then, I think, mean that you need to have 7 or 8% increases in health spending every year. And this makes Gordon Brown apathetic. He's supposed to have shouted at Blair, "You stole on my effing budget."
And the other thing that I think is very true to life is the extent to which policy announcements get driven by a media communications grid. And this is brought out very funnily in one of the episodes. It's not just that concept, which I think in a way has become a bigger and bigger concern about the extent to which policy is treated as secondary to communications plans, but some of the ideas they come up with, which were a mix of scripted and improvised in the moment by the actors, including desperately trying to come up with a new policy idea they can announce, the idea of a national spare room register. That sounds like just the sort of slightly weird policy somebody might announce at this autumn conference season. But also brilliantly, I had completely forgotten this. In the one of the deleted scenes that's included on the DVD as an extra, one of the policy ideas they improvise on the hoof is this idea of encouraging chess playing in parks. Now, no prime minister would ever take such an idea like that seriously, would they?
Absolutely never. I can't think of a single prime minister who would desperately try and do that in a
Yeah.
bid to think of a policy that was completely free.
And at the risk of segueing into one of our later categories, with when the cast are improvising some of those policy ideas, there is one moment that if you're watching, you absolutely have to pause, hit rewind, watch again really closely, which is there are three of them in the car, squashed together. One of them improvises the policy idea. So it's completely new to the two actors, never heard these words before, never seen them in the script. Maybe we should introduce a policy to require everyone to carry a plastic bag. And the look of complete bafflement on the other two is superb.
And yet, tax on plastic bags comes in after this is
And
so.
it's an excellent policy that has hugely curbed the scourge of plastic bags polluting and littering our countryside and our urban areas.
And there we go. That's the party political segment over for for this
Liberal
episode.
Democrat veterans of the coalition years.
Oh yeah, and also pet asbos, which
Absolutely, yeah.
if you Google pet asbos, you will find the occasional local council that tries to bring them in and the pushback.
There was this thing about dog passports for a while, wasn't there, which was linked to the pet asbo idea about do we in some way need to introduce controls on dog ownership because of some genuine tragedies involving very badly treated and hence violent dogs and the horrific consequences that can flow from that. But I particularly remember the dog passport controversy because I think the funniest political speech I've ever heard was from a Lib Dem at a Lib Dem conference opposing the dog passport ideas. And it culminated in the line about this policy is just so bonkers, it must have been come up by a cat.
Do you have many cats in your Lib Dem policy meetings?
No.
No, we tend to have camels in our committees. So I suppose something else that feels, again, I don't know, this might not be true, but feels true, is around the drafting of resignation letters and the idea that you've got. We're going to sack you, but we're not actually going to sack you. What we're going to do is you're going to stand down and you're going to write a resignation. Actually, I've already written your letter and then I've written the reply to your letter. But I'm going to brief the press that we're going to sack you and that's why you stood down. All that sort of stuff. Elements of that feel quite real, like that kind of ritualistic almost dance that happens, certainly especially
And
around the Peter Mandelson resignation. It sort of feels like,
which one of the Peter Mandelson resignations?
well, so my notes here says that actually after the first resignation, Peter Mandelson resigned quietly, left the government, and was never heard from again. I'm sure that's true.
We also get into the idea of a good resignation, so that if you resign early and take responsibility for something, even if it might not be fully your responsibility, that might smooth your path to a political comeback. And we've seen that with, well, I guess Mark Harper, Conservative minister, bit of an immigration related scandal. He sort of straight away took responsibility in a way that I think, he probably could have had a go at saying, look, this wasn't my fault, although in the end the buck stopped with me. This wasn't really my fault. But instead he resigned, and that cleared the way to him having a political comeback. At the time of recording, I guess Angela Rayner is hoping that she's partway through that process of having resigned. Obviously, in her case, it depends quite a lot about what HMRC will end up saying or not saying, but she's certainly got a better chance, I think, of a political comeback than if she had tried to hang on at the time.
Maybe you could almost include Alistair Campbell in that list of people who resigned quite
Yeah,
quickly, and therefore,
absolutely.
because obviously by 2005, I mean, the interesting thing actually about the Malcolm Tucker character is that Alistair Campbell wasn't part of the government when this comes out. So he resigned, I think, in 2003. And that does allow him to come back, for the 2005 election. He's sort of helping out, I think, officially, unofficially or something. He's helping out in 2010. And certainly now, his reputation has been rebuilt to the extent that he's appearing on political podcasts almost as big as this one. Again, we'll talk later about the idea of the zeitgeist tape. The fact that Tony Blair did get involved in popular culture and was called for the release of Deirdre from Coronation Street. Said he'd raise it with the Home Secretary. I want to see Jack Straw's face actually if Tony Blair did raise Deirdre, how it was done. But I suppose there was this sense that you had a Prime Minister that was getting involved in popular culture.
Yeah, and I think this is very much of the era where politicians have decided that to appear authentic, they have to fake being ordinary people, as opposed to by being authentic, by admitting that you're not an ordinary person and leaning into that.
How has that fake authenticity gone, Mark, do you think?
I don't think it's gone brilliantly for politicians. My real bugbear on this is milk. Once again, this may become a recurring theme of this podcast, given that we were talking about milk with Margaret Thatcher. But, one of the classic gotcha questions is, how much does a pint of milk cost? Oh, look, the politician doesn't know how much a pint of milk costs. Ha, 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 they're all out of touch, etc. But if, like me, you buy your milk in long life cartons, you buy milk in litres, not pints. The normal thing to do, if you are the sort of person, as millions of people are, who go into supermarkets and buy litre cartons of milk, is to not know what milk costs in pints. It's because you're always paying for it litre. It's a really good. We've got these really weird hang-ups about what's meant to make a politician ordinary. What are they meant to know?
It doesn't Ed Balls saying he confront Tony Blair with this question? I think that's something that Ed Balls says in his memoirs.
Oh, did he? Oh,
I think so. I don't think I've made. Pretty sure that's true. Well,
good for him then.
Speaking of tensions between Downing Street and the Treasury, just to round this off, the reason why I don't think it has aged is essentially almost the power that Gordon Brown had at the Treasury is still sort of there. They've got the institution, and Sam Friedman's quite interesting about this, isn't he? In his book, you've failed state. Like you've got this this quite powerful Treasury, but under New Labour, you had Tony Blair as this quite assertive Prime Minister who was able to sort of push back against it. And in the show, without wishing too many spoilers, there is that sense that actually the Prime Minister does push back against it. And actually one of the issues maybe now is you have Prime Ministers, not just the current one, who are maybe less willing to be assertive and push back against whatever the Treasury is trying to say.
I mean, I guess the real sign of how well the show has aged and how well it was based on real events is you can imagine if somebody was wanting to update the show, maybe to do a stage version or a film version, and basically take the plots from 2005, which is now just over 20 years ago, and update them. You could take all three of the plots, and with only a few little tweaks, the plot would feel like a contemporary plot. So the housing scandal plot, with a couple of tweaks, would be an Angela Rayner type housing issue.
Final allusion, because we could talk for about 3 hours on this. Downing Street Treasury tensions in New Labour years. Millions of words have been spilt. Not that you spill words, that's milk. Another incorrect milk allusion on this podcast. It's interesting that the flat that gives Hugh Abbott so much trouble is in Notting Hill, which is also where Peter Mandelson's house was in his, I think, first resignation.
I'm tempted to say, given the number of Peter Mandelson scandals, just by pure coincidence and luck of the draw, you're never going to be very far away from a Peter Mandelson connection or parallel.
You're no more than 15 yards away from a Peter Mandelson scandal in London. Speaking of scandal, Phil Willis Award, next item on the agenda. Who is the most evil or Machiavellian character in this film?
The boring, bland, beige answer is Malcolm Tucker. I want to go for Terry, though, because she is quietly reveling in all the chaos around her. And I can't remember whether this is a scene that's in the extras, so it was cut from the broadcast version, or whether it made it into the broadcast version. But there is one scene where she is almost talking gleefully on the phone about how others are about to be sacked and how she's going to have to deal with yet another new minister. And you just wonder, some of these leaks, that it's never quite clear where the leaks have come from. Is the secret story really that Terry is the one who's leaking them all?
This is the wrong section, Mark. I have to say, if I can object for a second, that we're putting in a new conspiracy theory into. I mean, Deep Throat. We need to talk about in next episode, and now we're talking about civil servants leaking on no evidence. I think for me, no one's particularly evil because you can sort of see where they're all coming from.
Mm.
And as we'll talk about later, this is very much politics as cock up. But I mean, there's a couple of times where Hugh tries to throw Glenn under the bus, which won't be for the last time that Hugh does this. And I think, given they're meant to have known each other for 30 odd years, that seems a little bit evil. As you say, Malcolm's he's not effective enough to be Machiavellian enough. Very, very new label. It's trying to control a thing which is, in essence, very uncontrollable.
He's too inept to be really Machiavellian. We come back to it's Terry.
Or Hugh, I don't know. I don't think if you're throwing friends under the bus. And I still, if you're going to have a leak inquiry, I think there'd be very little that you could pin on Terry. Which maybe makes
her goes to show how Machiavellian she was.
Oh, brilliant. The absence of evidence.
Exactly. That shows you just how good she was as a conspirator. The fact that you can't prove it.
Brilliant. Okay, so Mark's gone down a civil service blaming rabbit hole. In which case, let's go swiftly on to next item on the agenda. Barack Obama's tan suit. Best and worst bits of political detail in the film.
There's so much detail in the film. It's a little bit hard to winnow down. I think my two favourite little bits of detail is one is the amount of kudos that's given to anyone having any FaceTime with the Prime Minister, which feels like there's a big degree of truth in that. That's one of your sort of status symbols is, oh, I got to have dinner with the Prime Minister. The other is I love the items that are on the shelf behind the minister's desk, because there is this, and I think deliberately you can't recognise who it is, but there's a bust that looks like one of your busts of a 19th century or maybe politician, or maybe it's an ancient Greek philosopher. There's a Cleopatra's needle, which is a bit sort of weird art, but brilliantly, there's then a second Cleopatra's needle further down the shelf. And there's something about the sort of person who would have two Cleopatra's needles on their shelf. Seems to me a remarkably eloquent bit of set dressing.
On the ministerial boastings, so as well as FaceTime with the PM, I like the boasting about my bill had fewer amendments than the other minister. And I don't know if that's something that actually happens, but I quite like.
I've not come across ministers boasting like that, but obviously, I'm in the wrong party to come across ministers too often. I can imagine that happening. I got my bill through with only 4 days having to be allocated to committee stage and only having to give in on one amendment to the opposition in the Lords. That seemed quite credible.
So my favourite bit of detail, though, is the fact that the press clippings that Terry brings in are actual physical cuttings that have either been photocopied or cut out of the newspaper, which again tells you that 20 years isn't, although so much of this hasn't aged, in many ways in terms of the media management side of it, it really is a huge amount of time. Glenn's on a meeting on a Nokia phone, passing a post-it note to Hugh as well, like naughty schoolboys. But obviously now that would be a WhatsApp message.
I think you also spotted something interesting about the pictures on the wall, didn't you?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Mark, because there's a bit in the first episode, and I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, but obviously Hugh Abbott comes in because the other guys got fired. And the fact that both ministerial portraits are on the wall at the same time feels very...
unfortunate, yeah.
We've already started to cover this next item, a very British coup? Are there conspiracy theories in the TV show? Because apart from your completely insane conspiracy theory that actually Terry's the mastermind of everything, leaking everything to the press.
It is a theory that is compatible with all of the evidence that we have.
One of the main conspiracy theories is about the invention of a disgruntled civil servant, but which I feel is now more grist to your mill and going,
Exactly.
dearie me. Perfect. So the deep state, before Downing Street advisors are blaming civil service in national newspapers for their own failings, is nothing new. Again, thick of it feels very much more cock up than conspiracy, more so than Yes Minister. I don't know if it's so much a conspiracy theory, but again, I think tells you about how the media environment has changed in that the way that Malcolm Tucker is threatening journalists and politicians, it's essentially by cutting off their access. Or say, even just how to control the media environment, or the fact that you have politicians like Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott just weren't given airtime during the New Labour era. It mattered very much who the government would put up on the media round, whereas now Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott can, but as backbench MPs, they do not need to have government patronage to go on television. They can tweet something out and that will cause national news. And that element of it has massively changed.
Yeah, although I wonder how much that's a reflection of the current government and the approach that it's taking, and the relative paucity of media interventions by the Prime Minister means there isn't a lot of currency to be had in terms of who gets the exclusive with the Prime. There's just not a lot of that to go around. I can imagine a future government with a different Prime Minister being able to pick who gets the exclusive interview to capture the Prime Minister's reaction to the big controversial issue of the day might become quite valuable once again. But I think you're right. What has definitely changed is the ability for politicians to communicate directly, sort of sidestepping some of those media gatekeepers. But also, I think what is portrayed in this TV show is quite realistic in terms of what we know from, say, Damien McBride's memoirs and so on, about how access and being given sort of privileged preference for future news stories were definitely used as currency to influence, control journalists.
So we're recording this in the week that the interview with Stephen Colbert and James Tallarico was pulled from air, which I suppose in the past would have been, well, that's it. It's in the vault. It will never come out unless Terri, who apparently is the evil genius that controls the world, unless she leaks it. Whereas actually now it gets on YouTube, it gets 5 million views, donations go into his campaign. Like there's something, it's sort of slightly different about the nature of politics, isn't it? Whereas obviously your card is now marked for impugning the star quality of our Prime Minister, and that has been noted. But even the government ministers on the, I think so there is still a morning media round that a government minister will do.
Yeah.
And I suppose the extent to which that is useful, given you might be asked for 15 seconds about the policy you actually want to do. You'll then be asked for 3 minutes about what Donald Trump has said. And then you'll be asked for another 3 minutes on the chaos of the government that has nothing to do with your policy agenda you're trying to talk about. And how useful is that really? I realise we are in danger, and maybe we should just move straight there to talking about how to win an election, best and worst bits of political strategy.
The main strategy lesson is don't be driven by a Malcolm Tucker character, by which I mean don't be driven by somebody who keeps on screwing up. Definitely not a lesson everyone has learnt and applied in the 20 years since then. But also don't let the media plans override proper long-term policy thinking and development. And one of the reasons Malcolm Tucker is messing up all the time is there's basically no strategy, no message, no long-term policy plan.
And you can see that most directly in the focus group episode, can't you? Where essentially they have two contradictory policies. They've either got we're going to put all our arts funding into our most gifted and talented pupils, or we're going to put it all into pupils who are, say, more disruptive. So Terri, who, as we've ascertained, actually runs the British government, and probably a few European governments as well, is very much saying, do we have to make policy on the hoof? And is quite sensible about this. What is the policy outcome you want from this policy? Like, what is your objective? What is this for? And it seems like it's very much it very much in the show, it's a knee-jerk reaction to, we need to be popular, we need to have a reaction, we need to have this policy.
It's almost like there's a lesson there about you need to have an overall strategy rather than try to pick policies purely on the basis of what's going to be the most popular in the media the next day.
On focus groups generally, I mean, yeah, how useful would you say?
Yeah, I think there are two ways in which focus groups are genuinely useful. One, which we don't really get in this series, which is about giving you information from which you can then be better informed about making policy or communication decisions. But the other, which is the thing that the purists often look down their noses at a little, is the way that one memorable phrase will then really stick in a politician's mind. And actually, most politicians are so overworked and so bombarded with information that really personalizing and bringing to life in a memorable way a key insight is actually quite a helpful thing to do often. Obviously, if that insight is wrong or atypical, it's a very damaging and unhelpful thing to do. But done well, although strictly speaking, the one quote from one focus group participant may be a horribly thin basis on which to do anything, that might be the thing that sticks in the minister's mind in a way that 38 pages of detailed, rigorous crosstabs from multiple opinion polls are not going to at all. So I do think they have a value in understanding the why people are thinking what they're thinking, but also they do have a value, which is also a danger about how memorable they can be, which in a way is part of the one of the plot conceits that Armando Iannucci does an awful lot with.
Again, it's a bit like polling, I suppose, isn't it? That for a start, it's good to know what people are thinking about things. Just, that's your political platitude for this episode, listeners. If you're using it to sort of see what voters' conceptions are about your party, so like the questions about, what car do you see Labour as? What car do you see the Conservatives as? What fruit do you see the Lib Dems as? I think that's kind of interesting in seeing how your party is perceived from outsiders, which I think could be really hard to get sometimes.
Yeah, my favourite focus group finding is from a public focus group done, I think, by Deborah Mattinson, in fact, before she went to work for Keir Starmer, where people were asked what animal they thought each party knew. And this is your classic question that is so easy to ridicule. But the reason I love it is the thing that repeatedly came through for Keir Starmer at the time was people associating him with being an eagle. And there's a lot of quite subtle understanding of him that is encapsulated in that, because it's partly admirable. Eagles are generally seen in some way as a impressive animal, but they're also distant. You don't share photos of cute, cuddly looking baby eagles in the way that you would for lots of other animals. So there's something sort of a bit cold, a bit distant, a bit impressive. It's a very complex set of things that go into picking eagle, which I think, particularly given what we've seen, how the relationship between Keir Starmer and the public has played out since, I think it's actually very insightful. And you could easily spend hours and hours poring over opinion poll crosstabs and not get the amount of insight that you get from actually four people on Wednesday afternoon in Watford all said eagle.
And actually, that's quite disturbing for me because my Facebook feed is just full of videos of cute baby eagles. Now I have an explanation as to why. I suppose the other useful point of a focus group could be if you decided, okay, we're going to put all our money into arts funding for troublesome pupils strategy. You then might use a focus group to try and test different ways of how you might sell that policy. And if you've got different arguments for it, you might red team, you might see what are the arguments our opponents are going to make about the policy. None of that is done. Maybe the other strategy point about a focus group is who is conducting them. Ollie, whose idea the policy is the one who conducts the focus group. And it turns out, they like the policy. And I can't remember where I read it, but I think it was Philip Gould, who along with Deborah Mattinson was the great focus group guru, who has written some great, The Unfinished Revolution is a really good book on New Labour. I think it was Tony Blair who would say that often the focus groups would come back with the policy proposals that Philip Gould would usually be in favour of.
I think what the focus group episode really nails is that using a focus group to decide between two policies is a bad idea, but using a focus group after you've made your policy choice to understand better the reasons people might like or dislike the policy and hence how do you communicate the policy, that's actually a very sensible, helpful way of doing things. But rightly, the episode ridicules the use of focus groups to make the policy decision in the first place for you.
Right, lovely.
Yeah.
So,
Sideways tape.
production details to savour, and actually, it's quite exciting because the episode of The Thick of It, in which the Zeitgeist tape is a thing, is this one. If you're in need of a midlife crisis, feel free to rewatch The Thick of It after 20 years to see what they talk about on the Zeitgeist tape. Things like VH1, I didn't realise was still a thing 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the cleverest production details is the way they did the phone conversations as real. So whenever you see an actor speaking on the phone to another character, the other actor is actually sat, normally somewhere nearby on the phone doing the other end of the conversation. And that just makes all of those phone conversations that much more realistic because they are actually having a conversation. And it also plays into this really heavy use of improvisation. And so, because you're sparking off someone else, you can improvise through those phone conversations. And perhaps my favourite moment, I've mentioned the everyone should carry a plastic bag policy and the bafflement on the other two actors' faces when it's improvised. But perhaps my favourite moment is the Malcolm Tucker running down Whitehall. There is just something so beautifully funny about the way Peter Capaldi is running in that moment.
Especially because most of the camera work in this, it's handheld, which I suppose is probably a bit of a legacy of The Office as well, isn't it? It was very much that kind of early noughties. You want them to look like a documentary. It's more authentic.
But also, I think because of the low budget, they really go to town on that. So you've basically just got the cameramen in the room with the actors. The actors are mic'd up. There aren't sound people. There aren't lighting people. And so they can move and look at each other and move around the room in much more natural and plausible ways. They don't have to worry about being in the right spot for the beat of their next line.
And that's different to Yes Minister as well, because Yes Minister is definitely much more stagey. So it's live audience, fixed camera. It's
Sitting behind a desk almost all the time.
a dangerous place from which to view the world, Mark. I think we can agree.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, the phone conversations work really well. I mean, we thought about having actual conversations in this podcast, but actually what we do is Mark and I just we write the script in advance and just send voice notes to ourselves.
The other, I think, fun detail, which I assume is true, but Armando Iannucci says it in the DVD commentary, so there may be a bit of after dinner speech exaggeration about it. But what Armando Iannucci says in the commentary is that the signers doing the sign language version of the show had to invent 5 new signing sequences to cope with some of the more imaginative swearing that comes up in the show.
And sadly, we only have audio only on YouTube, so Mark can't demonstrate them for you. First live show.
I don't think I want this podcast to get an 18 plus rating. So
the other thing I quite like is that the first 2 episodes start with ministers carrying in red boxes. And you do just get the impression that maybe if they just spend a bit less time faffing about with media management and actually done their red boxes during the day, they wouldn't have to be worrying about them late at night. Final item on the agenda, state of play. With the reservations we said at the start, I think would still recommend. This is definitely worth watching, isn't it?
I'll probably be keener to watch one of the later sets of episodes that don't feature Chris Langham rather than plow straight on to this mysterious second DVD in the box that has episodes supposedly 4 to 6, but really series 2. But obviously different people have different views about how comfortable or not they feel with watching something featuring Chris Langham. Overall, I think pretty good. Better than, I think, the election movie. But also I'm probably less likely to rewatch it than the election movie. So on our scoring system, which I take full responsibility for, and I will continue to have growing doubts about whether it was a wise scoring system to pick. But as we've started with it, we have to pursue it on a scale of 0 to 650. I think I'd give this a 495, not quite breaking the 500 barrier.
Maybe we should put out to a focus group what's the scoring system we should use in future.
Well, I want to know if when we next have a parliamentary boundary review, which might change the number of MPs in Parliament, will we have to rebase our scoring system? We could end up coming up with the new notional scores for old episodes adjusted to the new size of Parliament.
Well, I mean, presumably it would mean that any films we watch set in big cities would presumably get a higher score.
Absolutely, of course.
So quite what that would mean for election in Omaha, I'm not sure. We'll have to see what the redistricting happens there. Been a bit more generous, maybe 520 is my score out of 650. I think there's some really good one-liners. It's aged really well. Some of the plots are really, really tight.
And I'm not sure we've said it enough in this episode. Peter Capaldi is just brilliant. Some of the other actors I think are genuinely scared when he's getting into some of the rants, striding angrily up really close to them. It is a brilliant, brilliant performance. In many ways, it was his breakthrough performance, and absolutely deservedly so.
Let's move on then to any of the business. Now, unlike Mark and Tucker, we don't want to threaten our listeners by cutting off their access to this podcast. So, Mark, if our listeners want to hear our next episode, what do they have to do?
They have to subscribe in their favourite podcast app. Political Fiction should be now appearing in all of the standard podcast apps on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and in many more obscure places as well. So please do sign up, because it means you'll get all of our future episodes appearing automatically in your feeds.
And if you do have time to write a review, or if you want to send some feedback we can deal with in Matters Arising, that would also be great. And what are we talking about next time?
But not if you're Malcolm Tucker, please. No Malcolm Tucker style feedback.
What are we talking about next time?
All the President's Men. Big hit movie from the 1970s. And I am most excited because I'm going to get to unveil my rant about how All the President's Men is a rewriting of history that is a bit like an Indiana Jones film and has given us the wrong lessons for US politics in 2026. Whether or not, dear listener, you get to hear any of that rant is all going to depend on how harshly Cory edits it down.
I've already got onto the British Sign Council to see if they can invent some new sign language for your rant. So speak to you next time.
Talk to you soon.